Good evening and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, Director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the President of Hunter College, I want to welcome all of you to a very special event. I know I say that for most events, but tonight, on behalf of Roosevelt House, and I see we have two members of our advisory board here, and I want to point them out, Dorothy Samuels and Tony Stepanski. Welcome. So tonight we have the privilege of launching a new series of public programs here, the Chris McNichol Lecture on Integrity in Government. And I think it may go without saying that we need this kind of examination most when commitments to and even expectations of integrity in government seem to be occurring least. That's a very awkward phrase, but you get the idea, I think. The McNichol series, we hope, will give us the opportunity to examine not only what used to be called good old-fashioned honesty in government, but also to chart complicated precedents and issues evolving from all the seismic changes in technology and communications that complicate our world and inspire, in a way, this first McNichol lecture. As I'm sure you all know, we are gathered in the one-time home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and his mother-in-law, who came with the house, as you all know, since she built it as a wedding present for Franklin Roosevelt and his bride in 1908, and then promptly said that the individual sets of rooms were too small and tore down the walls of Jericho on every floor. As Eleanor said, she was then on her side of the house at the least expected moments, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's why we call their residence the first New Deal. I do want to share what I've sort of repurposed into a true story of integrity in government that occurred here to all of our great benefit, I think, if not now, then soon. Think of FDR as president-elect in 1932, using the library upstairs as his transition headquarters, the small room. The then governor of New York, FDR, invites his state labor commissioner, Francis Perkins, to visit here. And the moment was fraught. It was the dark days of the Depression. People were demonstrating outside, which seems to happen now routinely at presidential transition headquarters, chanting, "We want food," outside on 65th Street. Francis Perkins suspects, almost fears, that the governor is going to ask her to be the United States Secretary of Labor, hence the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, an opportunity that would forever secure for her a place in history. When the offer came just upstairs, Perkins said to the president-elect, "I'll do it only if you agree to pursue old age pensions on a federal level as we began to do it in Albany." And FDR, who may have said no to something during his life, but I have yet to find evidence of it anywhere, said yes, of course. So that's integrity, putting her future in history at risk by insisting on a policy she believes so deeply in. And I think you may have guessed that the result was nothing less than Social Security. And then when Roosevelt said yes, Francis said, "What about child labor laws and minimum wage?" So she got it all. So when a man committed to integrity, Chris McNichol, came to visit us last year and made another offer we couldn't refuse, you'll understand why and how quickly we said yes. Chris visited Roosevelt House, some of you may remember, to talk about his just published book on Mike Bloomberg. He had a fresh story to tell, not only about the mayor's dedication to business and the environment and philanthropy, but about his, meaning Chris's, commitment to untangling the complex stories of public service, all built around the enduring expectation of integrity. And needless to say, he was a big hit, and not long afterwards we got together, and Chris generously agreed to sponsor a new lecture series devoted to this topic. So we're very grateful for the opportunity to open a dialogue about this crucial issue in this sacred setting. I'm especially excited. I would say my old friend Nick Confessori. My friend Nick Confessori is come to give the first McNichol lecture. I'm going to leave his official introduction to Chris, but Nick, welcome on behalf of the House. Chris has served as a senior executive in global investment firms. He earned his BA in economics and international relations from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD in American history from the University of Chicago. He served also as the treasurer of the American Historical Association. That's not easy to negotiate the funds that are contributed by 1,000 historians, so I admire that. He's the author not only of the aforementioned Bloomberg, A Billionaire's Ambition, but of To Be Mayor of New York, Ethnic Politics in the City, and The Power of the Mayor, David Dinkins. I would describe this Renaissance Fellow as a businessman, a historian, a mariner, a visionary, and very much a benefactor, and we are very, very grateful. So it's a pleasure to bring him to the podium and ask him to introduce our guest speaker. Please welcome Chris McNichol.
Well, thank you for that overdone introduction, Harold. I can say with confidence it's the first time I have ever been compared to Franklin Roosevelt, but thank you for that. I think the audience will make their own judgments. But welcome, everybody. I'm Chris McNichol. I'm the sponsor for this evening's lecture by Nicholas Confessori, titled Zuckerberg's Dream, America's Nightmare, The Future of Policy and Politics in a Privatized Public Sphere. It's the inaugural lecture in a series that's intended to draw attention to the importance of integrity in government. And the concept so basic to a democracy that purports to treat all of its citizens equally that it would be pedantic to try and explain why it matters. But it is worth saying that the United States at the moment, I believe, is facing a series of challenges that question the integrity of government, of our democratic government. And it makes tonight's topic and tonight's lecture particularly urgent. And one of the threats that'll come up through tonight's lecture, I imagine, is the toxic influence of money in politics that has been getting steadily worse for some time. The problem is hardly specific to Facebook, but the technology industry and social media have become so important to our lives that it's almost impossible to function as a normal citizen without access to some of those major technology industries. And they have characteristics that create a compelling public interest in determining how they're governed. Facebook's unwitting role as an agent of the Russian government trying to interfere with the 2016 presidential election is just one of many events that illustrates how important it is for us to determine how those companies are governed. And the circumstance presents a challenge. Is America up to the task of regulating the technology industry at a time when the influence of money in politics has rarely been greater? There have rarely been fewer controls on it. Roughly a century ago, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis wrote, "We must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook have accumulated a stunning degree of economic power. Apple alone is worth over $1 trillion, so is Amazon, and the five together generate annual profits in excess of $100 billion. In 2017, big tech invested $68 million in their efforts to influence the legislative process surrounding matters of interest to them. And so far, they've succeeded in limiting federal action. Justice Brandeis made his comments in response to the rise of a generation of robber barons who use their economic influence to dominate political decisions in Washington, D.C., and in capitals around the United States. At the time, we were well on our way to becoming a plutocracy, a nation controlled by a small number of super wealthy men, and they were all men. Our political system responded. During the last decades of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, political leaders acting in the public interest passed antitrust laws, and they placed controls on the activities that led to such a great concentration of wealth, such a dangerous concentration of wealth. The rules were appropriate for the times. The times have changed, and so the rules need to change, or the way that we enforce those rules. A fundamental element of our nation's earlier success, balancing the power of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and their like, was the existence of a cohort of muckrakers. It's an artful term for what we call today investigative journalists. Courageous, determined writers laid bare the way that the mighty use their economic power to affect political decisions and to affect people's lives. And any chance to place effective controls on the technology industry today is going to require similar exposure. And among the journalists who are determined enough and talented enough to play that role is Nicholas Confessori. Feeling a little pressure, Nick? Nicholas Confessori is a political and investigative reporter for the New York Times, and he's a writer at large for the Times Magazine. He wrote about super PACs in the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, and he was part of a team of reporters whose coverage of the downfall of New York State Governor Eliot Spitzer won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting in 2009. His recent landmark report on integrity, regulators, and referenda in Silicon Valley make him exceptionally well informed to deliver tonight's lecture. He's a graduate of Princeton University, and of particular relevance to this crowd, he attended Hunter College High School. So on behalf of the Hunter College educational community, I welcome you home, Nick, to deliver tonight's lecture.
Thanks, Harold and Chris, for that warm introduction. I'm gonna have to lean over to get this thing. Let's do this. I'm gonna start in the same place that Chris ended. At the turn of the 20th century, Standard Oil, founded by John D. Rockefeller, was one of the most profitable and powerful private corporations ever created in the history of mankind. Standard produced almost all of America's refined oil products. It had bought up all of its competitors and forced the rest out of business. Standard Oil had used that market dominance to forge secret deals with railways to impose higher costs on the companies that remained to compete. Rockefeller operated a network of paid informants, grocers and clerks and railway agents, to find out what other businesses were doing. His company deployed lobbyists around the country to head off reforms that threatened his business. His company was accused of bribing state lawmakers and even buying the election of a U.S. senator. Yet this vast company's workings were a mystery. Standard Oil was actually a trust, a collection of companies that owned companies that owned companies, a maze of stock transfers and partnerships and secret agreements. The interconnections were so opaque and layered that no citizen could possibly comprehend how the company actually did business. As the muckraker Ida Tarbell wrote of Standard Oil in 1904, you could argue its existence from its effects, but you could not prove it. Finally, in 1909, as we all know, the Department of Justice sued Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. 2 years later, the Supreme Court ruled in the government's favor, dismantling the biggest commercial enterprise in America. People in the tech industry often say that data is the oil of the 21st century. Data is a limitless natural resource. It is endlessly formed in the ether by ordinary people as they browse the internet, swipe their credit cards, call their friends, use apps, text their family. Everything you do online or with your mobile phone leaves a valuable trail of information. And two companies today, Google and Facebook, dominate this information marketplace in ways John D. Rockefeller would have admired. Almost all internet searches run through Google. Almost everyone in the U.S. Who has a social media account has an account on a platform owned by Facebook. These companies know more about you than any government. What they don't know, they can guess, based on how you browse, what you search for on Google, or the location data that your smartphone sends them without you knowing about it. Like Rockefeller, they have used that dominance to take over another industry, advertising. Today, Google and Facebook together control about half the worldwide market in digital advertising. Like Rockefeller, they have beaten the competition in part by innovating and in part by buying up competitors or exploiting their market dominance. Instead of cheap rates to ship oil, Google paid cell phone makers to bundle the Google app on their phones exclusively, a practice for which it was fined $5 billion this summer by the European Union, a price that would hurt even Google. Facebook has acquired over 70 other companies in its brief life. Some were acquisitions for talent, for engineers, and some were for products. And those products help them in different ways. Like Rockefeller, Facebook has sometimes spied on the competition. Facebook used a security app built by an Israeli company it acquired to secretly track the growth of a rival social media platform, Snapchat. According to the Wall Street Journal, when Facebook saw how popular Snapchat was getting, it paid a huge price to buy Instagram, a price that only made sense if they already knew how quickly Snapchat was growing. I think probably no one in this room is on Snapchat, but the kids love it. I'm not on Snapchat. Today, these companies too face a reckoning. Facebook and Google are under investigation around the world for abusing their market power and violating their users' privacy. Their leaders have been hauled before Congress and the European Parliament. Some critics on the right and left have argued that social media companies should be treated like cable companies or gas lines, as utilities. Some have even called for the two companies to be broken up, much as Standard Oil was over a century ago. I could spend an hour describing the parallels and echoes with the past and some differences. But the reason I began with Standard Oil is because of the differences between then and now. Something more important is at stake today, something that makes this moment more significant than the battles that the Gilded Age reformers fought against Standard Oil and other trusts. Facebook and Google control more than the advertising and search markets. They own the operating system of our politics and as a consequence of our governance. Social media platforms like Google Search, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter are our new public square. These platforms are where candidates raise money, talk to voters, and attack opponents. They are often the first place citizens go to learn about issues by Googling. They are not only where candidates reach citizens, but where citizens reach each other. More so than diners or coffee shops, social media is where politics takes place today. Silicon Valley doesn't control the marketplace for oil. It controls the marketplace in ideas. Until this year, I think most of us were accustomed to not worrying about this control. Some celebrated it. By some measures, social media is the most democratic form of mass media ever invented. These tools are free. In most countries, anyone can use them. On YouTube, any person can be a broadcaster. On Twitter, anyone can be a pundit. On Facebook, any person can own a newspaper. Sometimes these platforms have allowed historically disenfranchised people to amplify their voice in politics, and that's a good thing. I think we all agree. Black Lives Matter found power thanks to ordinary citizens who recorded and broadcast on social media evidence of police brutality and murder, creating a powerful force for government reform and integrity. Around the world, as we saw during the Arab Spring, platforms like Twitter can empower dissidents and reformers against state-controlled broadcast media. But looked at in a different way, these platforms are not free. For one thing, you do pay. You pay with your data, you pay with your privacy. I'll come back to that cost later. More critically, in place of the old information gatekeepers, the big television networks, the New York Times, where I work, the Wall Street Journal, Silicon Valley has interposed itself. This new public square is actually a private square. It is owned and operated for profit by a small group of corporations. Each corporation decides for itself, and only itself, what content is permitted on these platforms and what content is not. These companies' decisions are rarely public, and they are not subject to external review. Until recently, the rules themselves were secret. Only in April did Facebook first publish the guidelines that its employees and moderators and contractors use to adjudicate content violations. In this privatized public square, citizens have only the speech rights granted by the platforms. Facebook is exempt from the First Amendment on its platform. There is no free speech on social media, only a rough and shifting simulacrum of it. Each platform decides how and when to punish users who break their rules. And as with Standard Oil, the inner workings of this world are a mystery. The algorithms that return search results, or Facebook's newsfeed, are a closely guarded industrial secret. No one outside these companies can say exactly how they work. To paraphrase Tarbell, we can only guess at how they work by looking at the results they produce, at what Google suggests when we search for Donald Trump taxes, or moon landing, or Jews, or immigration. These rules are often rewritten. If Standard Oil controlled the pipelines and railroads that moved oil, Facebook and Google control the flow of information. It is no exaggeration to say that these two companies, especially Facebook, dictate how news and information spread around the world, and information drives politics. These companies are very intent on protecting their business model, as most companies are. Today, social media platforms and the huge torrents of data they collect are subject to no specific government regulation whatsoever. Indeed, over the last 2 decades, first Google and then Facebook began investing enormous amounts of money and clout in making sure things stayed that way. They have lobbyists in most states. They have started or bankrolled trade associations. They've made contributions to charitable organizations. Their employees give millions of dollars to candidates and super PACs. They used a lot of the same tools that John Rockefeller used to keep his empire intact, the same tools that large businesses have always used in Washington to get their way. Until recently, this money and clout did keep the government at bay. It helped kill a modest privacy bill proposed by President Obama. It helped kill even a voluntary code of conduct about facial recognition tracking, the ability of companies to track your face in public all the time. Few people in Washington wanted to be against these companies for years. To be against Silicon Valley was to be against innovation. To be against Silicon Valley was to oppose the future. Our elected officials wanted money from these tech billionaires. They also wanted the technology to win their own campaigns. For over a decade, the burgeoning social platforms of Silicon Valley have created their own rules. So what have those rules created? What kind of politics exists on these platforms? Politics that is eternally vexed, aggrieved, angry, excited, horrified, abusive, vicious, and low. A politics where the government or its opponents are always corrupt and evil. A politics of the mob dispensing swift summary judgment. A politics in which there is no precept of the public good. Silicon Valley did not invent these fears or this political style. It has always been with us in America and around the world. But platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have magnified and intensified it. Because social media is flat, because it is so democratic. Conspiracy theories don't live in dark corners. They are always adjacent to the truth. A Facebook page promoting the theory that Hillary Clinton's campaign manager was running a pedophile ring out of the basement of a Washington pizzeria can get as many readers as a 2-year Times investigation into President Trump's taxes. Self-described citizen journalists on the left gain enormous followings on Twitter by concocting elaborate, unproven theories about Trump and Russia. What do citizens learn when they go online? In the wake of the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, the top trending video on YouTube was a video claiming that David Hogg, a teen and later activist who survived the massacre, was a so-called crisis actor, a fake. One video I found last year claimed that Michelle Obama had 214 personal assistants and had purchased 4 yachts with taxpayer money. This video had close to 1 million views. On social media, you can buy a mob. It costs pennies. I've done it. Millions of computer-controlled accounts are posing as real people, deployed by businesses and governments as a tool of influence or slander. Anyone can buy or make them. You can buy likes on YouTube. You can buy 1 million followers on Twitter. You can buy the appearance of influence and social acceptance. And you can change what is acceptable. It's all against these companies' rules, but the rules are badly enforced. This year, my colleagues and I found that one tiny company in Florida, a company you've never heard of and probably couldn't find if you tried, had sold 200 million followers on Twitter. These platforms also give us proximity without closeness. We can connect with strangers living in a town 100 miles away, but without the real-world checks and manners that allow good people of different beliefs to share the same society. If someone who didn't like an article I wrote saw me at the grocery store, they probably wouldn't yell curses at me. But on Twitter, 1,000 people will call me names they would never say to my face. If I were a woman and not a white man, I would get rape threats. If I was black, I would get racist taunts. Just as often as social media empowers the disempowered, it empowers the already powerful. In many countries, social media is a tool of government disinformation and government oppression. It can even become a weapon for ethnic cleansing. In Myanmar, Facebook is so ubiquitous that many people confuse Facebook with the internet. The military there has used Facebook pages to broadcast false news aimed at stirring hatred of the Rohingya Muslim minority. They used troll accounts to drown out critics and start arguments. They posted sham photos of corpses that they said were evidence of a massacre perpetrated by the Muslims. It led to the largest forced migration of humans in history. Or look closer to home. As we all know now, social media platforms provided a powerful mechanism for foreign interests to influence our own politics and government. Russian agents ran an entire campaign on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. This campaign exerted a major influence on the 2016 election, helped along by the theft and public release of private emails from the Democratic Party. How big an influence, no one can say for sure. But there is no question that agents of a hostile power used these platforms to help elect a US president. What did the Russians use? Most of what you could find on the Russian Facebook pages was content that they had pirated from Americans. YouTube videos of police beatings on American streets. An internet hoax about Muslim men in Michigan collecting welfare for multiple wives. The Russians took the divisive and inflammatory content Americans were already creating and consuming, and they reflected it back at us like a magnifying glass burning an ant. This isn't an accident. These platforms are working exactly as they were meant to. Facebook and Google and Twitter want more interaction, more volume, more impressions, more users. This intensity, anger, and passion, most of all this fear, these are the emotions that make people sign on to these platforms and post comments and upload their pictures and press like or dislike. No one has ever built in history a better mechanism for bringing together people who believe the same things and then reinforcing those beliefs. No one has built a better mechanism for elevating and spreading conspiracy theories. It doesn't matter how crazy the idea is. Social media empowers the fringe as it disempowers the center. Many people spend more time on Facebook each day than they read newspapers or play sports or talk to neighbors. This is, in some sense, the future Silicon Valley wants. Of course, they don't agree. Nobody wants conspiracy theories on their platform. Nobody wants the abuse and the racist taunts and the fake news. And in the last year or two, each of these companies has taken steps to try to reform their own platforms, to make engagement on them more meaningful, as Mark Zuckerberg has said. They are looking more closely at content. They are hiring more people to moderate. They are tweaking the rules they wrote. They are even kicking off a few of the worst actors entirely. I think almost all of these efforts are sincere and well-intentioned, but they are unlikely to work. The problems these companies have are, in an important sense, problems they can't afford to fix. One reason these companies have grown so quickly and become so profitable is because their raw material is free. We give it to them all day, every day. The location of our phones, the content of our email, our pictures. The more we give them, the more they know. The more they know, the better they can target advertising, which is their true business. That is why they have fought so hard against consumer privacy laws that would limit how much data they collect. This wholesale collection of data is directly connected to the poisonous state of politics online. As Dipayan Ghosh and Ben Scott wrote recently in a paper for the New America Foundation, mass disinformation is powered by the collection and use of personal data online. Data feeds the programming that segments us into like-minded bubbles. Data is how these platforms learn to trigger an emotional response to content. That emotional response is what creates engagement and views and impression and profits. It is also what creates social division and polarization. It is what overrides our reason. The more we engage on social media, the more data we give them, and the more money they can make. It is a vicious circle. And bad actors, Russian agents or for-profit conspiracy mongers, have used it to their advantage. I don't know if Congress will pass new privacy laws. I don't know if the government will break Facebook and Google into smaller companies. I do think our country and our government face a serious choice that will shape the course of our politics for decades to come. We can continue to let companies like Facebook and Google grow and dominate. We can allow them to look over our shoulder as we browse the internet or post photos or chat with our kids. We can put their devices in our home and listen in on our conversations. We can keep allowing them to write their own rules. We can allow them to collect all the intimate personal data they would like. They will get better and better and better at predicting what we want, what we hope, what we fear. They will work very, very hard to give it to us, even if it strangles our politics and diminishes our democracy. Or we could pause. We can ask hard questions about the power these companies have acquired and the uses to which it might be put in the years to come. We can ask ourselves if we want a small group of men and women to control the code that shapes the flow of information for billions of people around the world. We can imagine a world in which your information belonged to you and where only you can sell it or rent it. If these companies have less information or are forced to collect this information or less of it, they will know less about us. The less they know, the more inefficient their platforms become, and the worse their targeting gets. We can imagine a technology industry where companies know enough about you to serve up ads for sneakers, but not enough to protect you from encountering people and ideas and arguments you might not agree with. If we want to make our politics smarter, we may have to make Silicon Valley dumber. Thank you.
So we have time for your questions. We have someone with a microphone, which we need you to speak into so we can continue recording this for our students and all that. So, question then.
Thank you. So at the very end of your speech, I guess you touched on the, what do we call it, the fee-for-service model? The fact that instead of getting all these things that we think are free, we would actually sign up, subscribe, and then control how the data is used, but it would still be collected, right? It's just that they could have limits on how it would be used.
It depends. So right now, as I alluded to, there's no basic consumer privacy regulation in America. The way collection is governed is essentially a use and consent model. They say, hey, we're taking your data, and you say, okay or not okay. If you say no, you can't use the app. And that's the preferred model of Silicon Valley. There are other models. Some of them are beyond my technical comprehension. There are blockchain models where you have code that encodes your entire social network, your finances, your pictures, and you provide access to it or not as you see fit. It's portable. You take it wherever you want. There are regimes like the one in California, which I wrote about for the New York Times Magazine recently, where Google can collect anything about you that you do on Google, but can't sell it to somebody else and can't buy someone else's data. So that's called first-party data collection, but there can't be third-party data collection. So I don't think it's all or nothing. I've calculated that just based on their revenues, each Facebook user is worth something like $30 a month. I'd pay $30 a month for private social networking. And in most of these scenarios, I think a lot of people argue that you can just have it be an option. I think what these companies are worried about is that it becomes popular. Their mantra is no one cares about privacy, so who cares? But what if? But people who study this say, well, look, it's hard to say Facebook or nothing because there is no real alternative. So it's not a real consumer choice. So you could provide layered access to information. You could provide first party, third party. There are different ways to do it, but no one has actually tried to do that. We created an internet from the beginning where everything was free. In some ways, it was the most terrible and consequential and greatest decision ever. It's what allowed all the growth. It's what makes Facebook available in countries without hard lines. But it also means that this surveillance capitalism, as some theorists call it, is the only business model. And it's possible for there to be other models.
Could you say a little bit about VPNs and private search companies where they say that, it's safer?
So I'm not a security expert. I've talked to many of them, and I've tried to take some of those steps. So if you're asking like kind of what can you do, I don't use Google for the most part, although I do have Gmail. It's kind of hard to avoid, but I use a web search called DuckDuckGo. I do almost all my work text messaging on a platform called Signal, which is encrypted end-to-end, can't be monitored, can't be eavesdropped, can't be taken. I think you have to get pretty aggressive and self-protective about the settings on your phone. I personally would never use an Android phone for anything. I saw one study recently that said that an Android phone out of the box with no apps activated sends location data back to Google 500 times a day. So I wouldn't use an Android phone. Apple has made a bit of a fetish that it's the privacy-minded appliance. Their business model is they sell you a freaking expensive phone, so they don't have to actually charge you and steal your data. But I think the broader point, and it's one I got into in my story over the summer on Silicon Valley, it is impossible for you or me to do this. It is impossible to escape the net because you got to use a credit card, and they got all your swipes. And there are now cameras on highways all over the country building databases of license plate images. So increasingly there are databases tracking every place you drive. And as they perfect facial recognition, and without any general law to govern it, anywhere you walk, you can be tracked in public with your kids, which aisle on the marketplace you're at. And the point just being like, this is the model Silicon Valley prefers because it requires you to be the expert. A guy quoted in my story said, it's like running a coffee shop and saying, well, some of this coffee has arsenic in it. It's up to you to figure out which one is safe. That's essentially the model. Another great metaphor he had was that, and I'm going to repeat it just because it's a useful way to think about this. If part of you is thinking, well, what's the deal? Who cares about privacy? Who cares that they can see what's on my phone? He's like, the business model for these companies is as if I set up a hotel and I said, you can stay in my hotel for free, but I'm going to have cameras in every room and I'm going to sell television shows based on what you do in the rooms, but I'm going to blur out your face. It's fine, right? It's not weird at all. When you put it that way, it seems completely creepy. And that's basically the business model with your cell phone.
Tell me how your concerns apply to China and its way of dealing with the internet.
I can do it very simply. Silicon Valley is building a commercial for-profit version of what the Chinese state is building to surveil its citizens. When we say that China is tagging members of minorities, tracking their movements, making them check in, we say, of course, that's authoritarian. But when Facebook does it, people say, well, I have Facebook. A guy I profiled over the summer in this before mentioned story put it well. He said, I think the people that run these companies are mostly good people. But what if someday they aren't? Already, the Pentagon and law enforcement agencies are buying data from these people. They're using it to track down criminals, and we all like that. But do you want this power to be in the hands of somebody that you would be fearful of? Do you want this power in the hands of our government eventually? I really think that the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which Chris alluded to, is like the Edward Snowden scandal for commercial surveillance. It's the scandal that made people realize there is potentially a cost they hadn't thought about to this ubiquitous surveillance and data collection. But that's how I think about it. What if?
Hi, do you see any partisan differences between the Republicans and Democrats and what they are saying about this, what they're planning to do, or they just all say, hey, sometimes it helps us, sometimes it hurts, what can you do?
It's a really fascinating question because for the longest time, one of the reasons these companies were beyond the reach of regulators is because neither party actually wanted to do anything about it. Republicans, as a rule, didn't want to regulate a big and growing industry. They didn't want to impose new rules or taxes on them, like sales tax. And Democrats, especially over the last 10 years after the crash, they're increasingly kind of alienated from Wall Street. They're already alienated from the oil business. There are few business sectors where the Democratic Party, the Progressive Democratic Party, has a natural alliance. And Silicon Valley was one of the only ones. These guys are pro-immigration. They're with us on center-left education reform, center-right education reform. They give us money. They're pro-gay marriage. These are our guys. And they have the keys to the castle. They had the technology that elected Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And we want that technology for our own campaigns. We want these companies to send in their best engineers to teach us how to use their tools most effectively to win. And that was the consensus. And what shattered that consensus was a couple of different things. I think Cambridge Analytica was a big one. For a lot of voters, rightly or wrongly, they suddenly said, big data from Facebook went to this company and elected Donald Trump, and I hate Donald Trump. So for the half of the country that doesn't like Donald Trump, that was a big wake-up call, and that really severed a lot of the natural affinity between big tech and the Democratic Party. The Republicans have a different thing going on. And candidly, it's hard to know how much of it is really in good faith and how much of it is in bad faith. I've talked to Republicans who say the reason we keep bashing Google is it's good politics. Our base loves it. You will find isolated examples. Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee had an ad up that essentially was very grisly. It was an abortion ad, and moderators banned it. It's probably a bad decision. And so conservatives said, this is crazy. You're censoring conservative speech. I think as these companies tried to get a grip on Russian and of course Russia was the other big factor, as these companies tried to get a grip on misinformation and quickly scale up and build moderation and content moderation, they were making rules on the fly, and they weren't always good rules. I don't think it's true that these companies systematically bias content and results in searches, but they could, and you would not know it. And that's one of the things that is kind of scary. So conservatives in Washington have made the criticism that these companies are too big and powerful. They're run by people who are lefties. We don't trust them. We don't trust them having the keys to this machine. And you see the most amazing thing, which is the same party that just engineered the overturn of an Obama rule on telecommunications company called net neutrality, saying we don't want utility-style deregulation of telecoms, is now talking about imposing that kind of regulation on social networks. And I think it's maybe the first time I've ever seen Republicans in the modern era call to treat something like a utility again.
Could you please ask the audience for a show of hands of who has actually read in its entirety a Google or Apple licensing agreement before they've agreed to it?
Wow. Let's ask. So, this gentleman asked, raise your hand if you have ever read a Google or Apple end user license agreement or privacy policy in its entirety. Before you agree to it. I have to say, I'm very, very impressed.
So based on your research and study, are there one or two regulatory reforms that seem to balance sort of the opportunity as well as the unintended consequences that you think should be seriously considered? And are there any structural government reforms that you think ultimately would lead to better views on the issue?
Well, as a reporter, I usually try to steer away from policy recommendations. What I will say is there are a couple of ideas on the table. The hardcore privacy position is GDPR for America. So take the same new regulations they have in Europe, which require a lot more consent from users, lots more opting in, and bring it to the U.S. And the argument in favor of that is these companies are already doing it in Europe now. They were forced to do it in Europe. They can turn it on for American consumers. They can do it anywhere in the world now. It isn't that hard anymore. They argued for a long time it's too complicated, Now they have it somewhere, so they can have it everywhere. The argument against it is, burdensome rules. It will stifle innovation. This is why they don't have Google in Europe. That's why it's in the U.S. On the other end, what the industry is proposing right now is essentially a very light touch general consumer privacy law. No specific rules, no specific things that they can or cannot do, just a series of principles they have to adhere to, things like context, where when I go onto the New York Times website, they shouldn't be selling my data to some place that I would never expect it, having gone to the New York Times website. And then in the middle, what they did in California, which was kind of interesting, is this guy I wrote about, he's a real estate developer who funded a ballot initiative. He took a kind of a middle course. Instead of saying, we're going to have GDPR or nothing, he said, we're going to allow all those first-party relationships. So when you go on Google, whatever they can figure out about you from what you're doing on Google, they can have. But if Axios goes and buys all your credit card data, they can't sell it to Google if you don't want them to. So you can say no, you can opt out. And in McTaggart's view, the benefit of that is you're basically taking the internet back to 10 years ago in terms of the business model. Banner ads. If I'm Googling for Bible studies, they can show me an ad for Bible studies. What they can't do is buy and swap data back and forth behind the scenes, where when you log into Spotify, you're actually logging into 300 different companies that are all getting what you do on Spotify. Forget about that. So you have those three versions. I think the reason the industry is talking about a rule now is partly the California initiative and a law in Illinois make them want a weaker and overriding federal statute. And partly because the party that tends to favor lighter touch regulation is in power. If they advance a proposal now, maybe they can get one that they can live with and call it a day and say they gave it to us. But I don't know what's going to happen.
Two quick questions. Senators sometimes become aligned with an issue, Sheldon Whitehouse with climate or something like that. Which senators are aligned with this issue? That's question one. And then briefly, do you think there's a capacity that is either in place or utilized by tech companies to actively listen to what's going on? And if so, how do they utilize it?
So as far as the first question, Senator Thune from South Dakota on the Republican side, I think has been pretty aggressive on some of the privacy abuses in terms of companies not doing things they promised to do. Senator Warner and Senator Burr on the Senate Intel Committee have been very active on the question of disinformation and Russian involvement, as well as Facebook's data practices. Senator Hatch has been all over Google lately. So is Senator Grassley, actually. Google does, in some ways, people always tell me on the right, you're always saying Facebook, Facebook, Facebook. What about Google? And Google is by far the bigger player, the bigger and greedier collector of data. So both of these companies have had some. As your second question, I've already lost track of it. Tell me again. Your second question again, your mind? Right. So I would go on, not Google, but DuckDuckGo, and look up a Planet Money episode about this, which is really interesting. Everyone's convinced that their phones are spying on them by listening in. And so in this episode, they took call-in stories of like, I said this, and the next day I got an ad for this. And we've all had that. I was like, I think I asked my wife if she wanted a cocktail one night, a Negroni, and I got served an ad for Campari. And it was like, wait a second. But what they show in the Planet Money episode is actually even scarier. It's not that your phone can listen to you, it's that it doesn't need to. The machine learning that they do is so advanced that they can guess what you're interested in by what you've put into their data stream. They can make incredibly educated and accurate guesses. They know if you're pregnant. They know if you're having an affair. They know if you're thinking of quitting your job. They know if you're about to buy a house. They know a lot about you, or they can guess a lot about you. It is extraordinary. And in some ways, that power is more dangerous than simply having a microphone. But if it makes you feel any better, I refuse to buy any of those devices for my house. They don't have an Amazon Echo. They don't have any of those things. I think it's insane.
What is the episode on Planet Money?
I don't remember what it was called, but if you Google this topic, I think they did a fun episode about it.
Also, the thing that you mentioned about you can't get on so many websites unless you agree to cookies. Is that something that can legally be banned?
Well, it's a great question. So that model, like consent or find something else, they love that model because often there is nothing else. And it puts all the onus on the consumer, all of it, to decide if the transaction is fair, if it's a fair exchange of value. Back to that California regulation, one thing that's interesting about it, McTaggart came to the conclusion that a flaw in GDPR, right? So after they put into place GDPR in Europe, every website had these pop-ups like, please agree, please accept, please give us permission. And like you could not do it, but then like these things keep popping up in your screen. So everyone says okay. What his bill originally said was you can withdraw consent. And if you do, they have to give you the same product and service. So they can't discriminate if you won't let them sell your data. I thought that was innovative. That was an interesting way around that problem. He thought it presented a better consumer model than GDPR. Everyone knows what GDPR is, right? No, the General Data Protection Regulation, I should have said that earlier, I'm sorry. It's this big European regulation that went into effect recently, and it's a very strong consumer privacy law, fairly complicated, and the industry fought it and fought it and fought it and lost.
You know, as we talk about how we are beginning to lose privacy in both the public and private spheres, you know, it's often said that once you walk outside, you forfeit any expectation of privacy. And as you may know, Amazon recently had a controversy where they were developing facial recognition technology and marketing it to local law enforcement. And, you know, we live in a city that has the largest law enforcement agency in the country. So what is your opinion about the proliferation of such technology, like as has been, or is currently being explored in, you know, like the UK, which is a country with the most surveillance cameras per capita, and in China, where it's authoritarian and their state media tout their growing facial recognition capability, whether or not it's true or just an intimidation tactic. So what's your opinion about that?
Well, as we were talking about earlier, look, the industry wants to build this capability. If any of you have seen the Tom Cruise movie Minority Report, they could build that now. Not the telepathy part, but the part where you walk into the mall and the customized ad holograms at you and knows who you are. They could do that right now if they wanted to. The only reason they haven't done it is because everybody intuitively feels that it's creepy and they haven't figured out how to roll it out, but they want to do it. When Obama proposed his privacy bill, there were also working groups around this issue, facial recognition. And the privacy advocates walked out after about a year because they asked the industry to agree to the principle that they would have to get your permission to scan your face in public, and the industry said no. Or parts of the industry said no. So, like we were saying before, I think that what China is trying to build for government purposes, we're trying to build here for commercial purposes. And I don't know why that should be any less intimidating, because once it's built, once the power exists, it can be abused. And once the information is there, it can be purchased by anybody. So I think facial recognition it's the scariest thing that I haven't been able to get into in any of my stories yet, but it makes all the rest of this stuff child's play. You can leave your phone at home. They can still track you, where you go, what you're looking at, which product your eyes linger on in the grocery store. They can do all of that eventually. You can't escape ubiquitous commercial surveillance when it's based on ubiquitous facial recognition.
You know, this is the first event we have had here in about 2 years at which a cell phone did not ring. They have been effectively chilled and still. So we are going to invite you all to join us upstairs in the Four Freedoms room for a reception in honor of Nick and in honor of Chris. But first, join me in thanking both of them for making this.
Thank you.